Lydia had always dreamed of a quiet life in New England, surrounded by the smell of pine and the sound of autumn leaves. She finally bought a small house, but her excitement faded when she saw the neighbor's property. It was a rotting structure with boarded-up windows and a yard full of rusted scrap metal. A man named Ray sat on the porch, staring at her with unblinking, hollow eyes that made her skin crawl instantly. A few weeks after moving in, a strange, sweet chemical odor began to seep into Lydia's kitchen during the night. It wasn't the smell of a normal household cleaner. It was heavy, metallic, and made her lungs burn with every breath. She looked out her window and saw Ray carrying heavy blue plastic barrels into his dark basement. The flickering light from his cellar revealed a lab filled with glass tubes and bubbling green liquids. One evening, the silence was shattered by the deafening roar of sirens as 5 police cruisers swarmed Ray's house. Lydia watched from behind her curtains as Officer Miller led a team with guns drawn toward the front door. Ray was dragged out, screaming about the formula and the silver, his face twisted in a drug-induced frenzy. It was a massive PCP lab, and the entire neighborhood was now considered a hazardous biozone. Officer Miller knocked on Lydia's door, his face pale behind a heavy black respirator mask. He told her that Ray had accidentally spilled a large container of liquid mercury near the property line. The toxic substance was soaking into the soil of Lydia's prize-winning vegetable garden. He warned her not to touch anything and to evacuate for the night while the biohazard unit cleaned the area. The thought of the poison in her food made her sick. Lydia spent the night in a cold motel room, unable to sleep as she imagined the silver poison spreading through the roots of her plants. When she returned, she found her garden covered in yellow tape, and the soil turned a sickly, ashen gray. Despite the cleanup, she felt like the house itself was now stained. She started noticing Ray's shadow standing at the edge of the woods every evening, even though he was supposed to be in a jail cell. To her horror, Ray was released just a month later due to a technicality regarding the evidence storage. He returned to his rotting house, more aggressive and erratic than before. He began sitting on his back porch for hours, holding a pair of binoculars and tracking Lydia's every move. She felt his gaze like a physical weight on her back, even when she was deep inside her own home with the doors locked and the lights turned off. The psychological warfare escalated when Lydia found a trail of shimmering, liquid silver beads leading from Ray's porch directly to her front door. It was mercury, pure and deadly, laid out like a welcome mat. She realized Ray wasn't just a drug manufacturer. He was obsessed with cleansing her property with his toxic chemicals. She called the police, but the wind had scattered the beads, and Ray just laughed as Officer Miller questioned him on his porch. One night, Lydia was awakened by a violent scratching sound against the side of her house. She grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window to see Ray's large, scarred pit bull digging frantically at the foundation. Ray stood in the shadows, whispering commands to the dog in a low, guttural voice. The dog looked possessed, its eyes reflecting the light with a terrifying red glow. Lydia realized that the fence was no longer enough to keep the madness out. Desperate for safety, Lydia installed a high-tech security system with cameras and motion-activated floodlights. The first night, the cameras were active. She caught Ray standing in the middle of her driveway at 3 a.m. He was holding a small child by the hand, a boy Lydia didn't recognize. Ray was pointing at Lydia's bedroom window and whispering into the child's ear. The sight of the innocent boy in the hands of a madman made Lydia's heart stop in pure terror. Lydia sprinted to the phone to call 911, but the line was dead. She looked outside and saw that Ray had used a pair of rusted garden shears to cut the wires. He was now walking toward her front door, leaving the child behind in the driveway. The floodlights kicked on, illuminating his face. It was covered in silver paint, making him look like a metallic demon. Lydia grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and braced herself for the impact. Lydia stood frozen in the hallway, clutching the iron poker as the front door creaked. The silver-faced man, Ray, didn't rush in. He stood on the threshold, his eyes scanning the room with a predatory calm. He began to hum a distorted lullaby that echoed through the silent house, making the air feel heavy and cold. Lydia realized that the man standing before her was no longer the neighbor she once knew, but a shell fueled by chemical madness and dark intent. Before Ray could take another step, the distant sound of a second siren cut through the night. It wasn't the police, but an ambulance arriving for the child Ray had left in the driveway. The distraction was enough for Lydia to sprint toward the back kitchen door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She burst out into the cold air, heading for the dense woods behind her property, hoping the shadows would hide her from the silver-faced monster. The woods were thick with thorns that tore at Lydia's leggings as she ran blindly through the dark. Behind her, she could hear the heavy thud of Ray's boots hitting the earth, rhythmic and persistent. He wasn't running. He was tracking her, confident that she had nowhere else to go. The smell of the sweet, metallic PCP fumes seemed to follow him, drifting through the trees and making Lydia's vision blur as she struggled to find a place to hide. Lydia found a hollow log near a frozen creek and crawled inside, pressing her face against the damp bark to muffle her breathing. Through a small crack, she saw the beam of a flashlight cutting through the fog. Ray was standing just 10 feet away, his silver face shimmering under the moonlight like a ghost. He tilted his head, listening to the forest, his hand resting on the hilt of the rusted garden shears he had used to cut her phone lines earlier. Suddenly, a loud snap of a twig came from the opposite direction, drawing Ray's attention away from the log. It was a large deer, startled by the commotion, leaping through the brush. Ray let out a low, guttural growl and took off after the sound, disappearing into the deeper part of the forest. Lydia waited for what felt like hours, her limbs numbing from the cold, before she dared to crawl out and head back toward the lights of the main road. By the time she reached the pavement, Officer Miller was already there, cordoning off her house with more yellow tape. He looked relieved to see her, but his face turned grim when she told him about the child and the silver paint. They had found the boy shivering in the driveway. He was a runaway from a nearby town whom Ray had snatched hours earlier. The police launched a full-scale manhunt in the woods, but Ray had vanished into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. Lydia moved into a high-security apartment in the city the next day, leaving everything she owned behind. She couldn't bear to look at the garden where the mercury still lingered in the soil, a permanent scar on the earth. She spent her nights staring at the security feed on her phone, waiting for a silver face to appear in the lobby. The trauma had hollowed her out, leaving her with a constant sense of being watched by someone who wasn't truly human anymore. 2 months later, Lydia received a mysterious package with no return address. Inside was a single shriveled bell pepper from her old garden, coated in a thick layer of dried silver paint. There was no note, but the message was clear. Ray knew where she was. She realized that the technicalities that kept him out of prison were part of a much larger, more terrifying failure of the system that was supposed to protect people like her from predators. She took the package to the precinct, but without a fingerprint or a witness. Officer Miller said there was little they could do. He looked older now, tired of the endless cycle of crime and release. He pulled Lydia aside and whispered that Ray had been spotted in 3 different states, always near chemical plants or industrial sites. It seemed Ray was building something new, a larger lab where he could perfect his toxic mixtures away from the prying eyes of the law. Determined to fight back, Lydia began researching Ray's past. She discovered he was a former chemist who had lost his license after a violent outburst at a university lab years ago. He had been obsessed with the idea of mercury transmutation, believing he could achieve a higher state of consciousness through controlled poisoning. The formula he screamed about during his arrest was real, and he was using his victims as unwilling test subjects for his experiments. Lydia's investigation led her to an abandoned warehouse district on the edge of the city. She saw a familiar rusted truck parked behind a row of decaying brick buildings. Her heart raced as she checked her pocket for the pepper spray she now carried everywhere. She knew she should call Miller, but she also knew Ray would be gone by the time the police arrived. She decided to gather her own evidence, creeping toward the warehouse with her phone camera ready. The air inside the warehouse was thick with the suffocating smell of ammonia and sulfur. In the center of the room, a massive glass vat was filled with a swirling, iridescent liquid that glowed with a sickly green light. Ray was there, his back to her, working feverishly at a control panel. He had replaced the silver paint on his face with a complex lattice of metal wires that seemed to be fused directly into his skin. He looked like a machine made of flesh and madness. As Lydia raised her phone to take a photo, a floorboard groaned under her weight. Ray stopped moving instantly. He didn't turn around, but his voice echoed through the warehouse, sounding metallic and cold. "I told the boy you would come, Lydia," he whispered. "The mercury connects us all. It flows through the soil, through the water, and now it flows through you." He turned slowly, the wires on his face sparking with a faint blue electrical current. Lydia realized with horror that the water she had been drinking in her city apartment might have been contaminated too. Ray had been following her, sabotaging the pipes in her new building. She felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over her knees buckling as the warehouse began to spin. Ray approached her with a syringe filled with a glowing silver liquid, his eyes wide with a terrifying kind of love. He wanted her to join him in his distorted chemical world. Just as Ray reached for her, the warehouse doors burst open. Officer Miller and a SWAT team flooded the room, their tactical lights blinding in the darkness. Ray let out a scream of pure rage and threw a glass beaker at the floor, creating a massive cloud of toxic gas. In the confusion, Miller tackled Ray to the ground, pinning him under the weight of his gear. Lydia was dragged outside into the fresh air, coughing and gasping as the paramedics rushed to her side. Ray was finally sent to a high-security psychiatric facility for the criminally insane, located on an island far from the coast. The Silver Demon was finally behind bars that he couldn't melt or bypass with legal tricks. Lydia underwent months of treatment to flush the toxins from her system, her body slowly recovering from the ordeal. But the mental scars were deeper. She still couldn't look at a garden or a silver reflection without feeling a cold shiver of dread. She eventually moved to a desert climate where the air was dry and the soil was sandy, far away from the damp New England woods. She found a job as a digital archivist, working from home where she could control every aspect of her environment. She had 3 different security systems and a dog that never left her side. She had survived a monster, but the price of that survival was a life lived in a state of permanent, quiet vigilance against the world. One afternoon, while browsing the news, she saw a small headline about a fire at the island facility where Ray was being held. The report said the fire was caused by a chemical reaction in the laundry room and that several inmates were missing. Lydia's hand began to shake as she closed the browser tab. She walked over to her front door and checked the 3 deadbolts, her reflection in the hallway mirror looking back at her with eyes that had seen too much. She went to her small indoor garden, where she grew only herbs and filtered water. As she reached for a sprig of basil, she noticed a faint, shimmering silver dust on the leaves. She blinked, wondering if it was just a trick of the light or her own fading sanity. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The nightmare of the Mercury Alchemist was supposed to be over, but she knew that some poisons never truly leave your system once they've entered your life. Lydia sat on her porch as the sun set over the desert, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. She watched the horizon, knowing that somewhere out there, a man with a silver face might still be humming that distorted lullaby. She was no longer the victim he had targeted in that New England suburb. She was a survivor who knew how to fight back. She gripped the hilt of the iron poker she still kept by her chair, ready for whatever the darkness might bring. Sarah lived in a modern apartment building where she felt safe behind multiple locked doors and security cameras. One rainy afternoon, a man knocked on her door, claiming to be her new neighbor from down the hall. He introduced himself as Jake and asked to use her Wi-Fi because his service was down. Sarah felt a strange vibe from him. His smile was a bit too perfect, and his eyes stayed cold, even while he laughed at his own jokes. She politely refused to let him in, offering to call the building manager for him instead. Jake's expression shifted instantly from friendly to menacing, his jaw tightening as he stared at her through the small gap in the door. He eventually turned and walked toward the elevator, but Sarah watched through the peephole and noticed he didn't press a floor button. He just stood inside the moving car, staring at the closed metal doors with a blank expression. A week later, Sarah met her best friend Jenna for coffee to catch up on their busy lives. Jenna was glowing, talking about a new guy she met on a dating app who was cultured, charming, and a total gentleman. She pulled out her phone to show Sarah a photo, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. It was Jake. He was wearing the same navy polo shirt he wore the day he knocked on Sarah's door. But in the photo, he looked like a completely different, kinder person. Sarah explained the creepy encounter at her apartment, but Jenna was conflicted because Jake had been so perfect to her. He had told Jenna that he was a divorced father who was struggling to find a new place to live. However, he told Sarah he already lived in her building. They realized Jake was weaving a web of lies, creating different personas for each woman. They decided to dig deeper, unaware that Jake was already watching them from a car parked across the street. Sarah started receiving anonymous messages on Facebook from a profile with no picture, claiming to have information about her past. The messages contained personal details that only her closest friends knew, stories about her childhood, and even the layout of her bedroom. She realized that Jake hadn't just been dating Jenna. He had been stalking Jenna's social media and friends list to gather intelligence on Sarah, moving through their lives like a ghost. One night, while Sarah was home alone working on a math assignment, she heard the distinct sound of her front door opening. She froze, remembering she had forgotten to lock the deadbolt after taking out the trash. She waited for the sound of the dogs or her parents, but there was only a heavy, rhythmic silence. Footsteps began to creak on the hardwood floor, moving slowly toward her bedroom. Each step sounded deliberate, as if the intruder was savoring the moment of her fear. She turned off her desk lamp and crouched behind her bed, her breath hitching in her throat. The door handle turned slowly, the metal clicking loudly in the quiet room. A tall silhouette in a navy polo shirt stepped inside, illuminated only by the moonlight through the curtains. It was Jake. He didn't look for her. He walked over to her desk, picked up a framed photo of Sarah and Jenna, and traced Sarah's face with a long, trembling finger before whispering, "I found you." Panic surged through her, and Sarah realized she had to move now or never. When Jake turned his back to look in her closet, she sprinted past him, her socks sliding on the floor. She didn't look back as she flew down the stairs and out the front door, screaming for help. She ran until she reached a brightly lit grocery store 2 blocks away, her lungs burning and her mind racing. She called Jenna, but Jenna's phone just went straight to voicemail, which was highly unusual. The police arrived at the apartment, but Jake was gone. He had left something behind, though. A handwritten script on Sarah's pillow detailing a perfect date between him and Sarah, ending with them leaving town together forever. Even more disturbing was a map of Jenna's gym and workplace with red circles around the exits. Sarah realized that Jake wasn't just a liar. He was a predator who had been planning a double abduction for months. Suddenly, Sarah's phone buzzed with a video call from Jenna. She answered, but instead of her friend's face, she saw a dark basement. Jenna was tied to a chair in the background, looking terrified. Jake's face appeared on the screen, his eerie smile wider than ever. He whispered into the camera, "She told me everything about you, Sarah. Now it's your turn to come and get her." "I'm waiting where the Wi-Fi actually works." The call ended, leaving Sarah in a world of silence. Sarah sat in the back of the police cruiser, staring at the grainy image on her phone of Jenna, tied up in that dark basement. The officer beside her was typing rapidly on a laptop, trying to trace the signal from the video call. "He's using a proxy," the officer muttered, his face illuminated by the blue light of the dashboard. Sarah felt a cold knot of guilt in her stomach. She had led Jake right to her best friend by ignoring the warning signs of his obsession. The script Jake had left on her pillow was more than just a fantasy. It was a roadmap. Sarah realized the locations mentioned weren't random. He had described a cabin by the lake where the Wi-Fi never dies, a place Jenna had mentioned during one of their first dates. Sarah grabbed the officer's arm and told him about a summer rental Jenna's family owned 3 hours north. It was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and exactly the kind of stage Jake would choose. As the police convoy sped through the night, Sarah received another text from Jake. It was a photo of her own front door with the words, "I forgot my keys. Can you let me back in?" He wasn't at the cabin. He was back at her apartment, playing a sick game of cat and mouse. He wanted her to choose between saving Jenna and protecting herself. Sarah realized that Jake was watching the police move through his own network of hacked security cameras in her building. "He's not at the cabin." Sarah screamed, showing the phone to the sergeant. They performed a screeching U-turn, heading back toward the city. But as they arrived at Sarah's building, they found it completely dark. The power had been cut, and the backup generators had been sabotaged with a heavy industrial acid. Jake was inside the darkened tower, moving through the hallways he had scouted for weeks, waiting for Sarah to walk into his trap once again. The SWAT team entered the lobby, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness like lightsabers. Sarah insisted on following them, knowing the building's layout better than anyone. They found the elevator doors pried open, the cables cut and dangling into the pit like giant, dead snakes. Jake was using the service stairs, moving between floors with a speed that suggested he had practiced this escape many times before. He was a phantom in a navy polo shirt, laughing in the dark. On the 12th floor, they found Sarah's apartment door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the walls were covered in hundreds of photos of her and Jenna, all connected by red string like a frantic detective's board. In the center of the living room was a laptop, still connected to the basement feed. Jenna was still there, but now she was crying, pointing at something behind the camera. Sarah looked closer and saw a pair of boots. They weren't Jake's boots. They were her own father's boots. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Jake hadn't just been dating Jenna. He had been impersonating Sarah's father online, gaining Jenna's trust by pretending to be her best friend's family. He had used deep fake technology to mimic her father's voice during phone calls. The Jake persona was just one of many masks he wore to dismantle Sarah's life piece by piece. He didn't want to just date her. He wanted to become her entire world by destroying everyone else. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the kitchen pantry. "The script says you're supposed to be alone, Sarah." Jake stepped out, holding a tablet that controlled the locks on the doors. He pressed a button, and heavy steel shutters slammed down over the windows and the entrance, trapping Sarah and the officers inside the apartment. He had turned her home into a high-tech dungeon. He looked at the police with a look of pure boredom, as if they were just extras. One of the officers fired a taser, but Jake dodged it with an unnatural agility, sliding behind the kitchen island. He threw a small device that emitted a high-frequency screech, causing the officers to drop their weapons and clutch their ears in agony. Sarah, protected by her own noise-canceling headphones she had been wearing for her math homework, was the only one still standing. She grabbed a heavy glass vase and threw it at Jake's head, catching him off guard. Jake stumbled, his tablet sliding across the floor. Sarah dove for it, her fingers frantic as she tried to find the override code for the shutters. She saw a folder labeled "The End" and opened it. It contained a live feed from the basement where Jenna was being held, but there was also a countdown timer labeled "Ventilation." He was planning to pump carbon monoxide into the basement if he didn't get his happy ending with Sarah. She had seconds to save her. She found the code. It was her own birthday. She typed it in, and the shutters began to grind upward. At the same time, the basement ventilation system reversed, pulling the deadly gas away from Jenna. Jake let out a scream of fury and lunged at Sarah, his hands reaching for her throat. But the officers had recovered, and they tackled him to the ground, pinning him against the wall covered in Sarah's photos. The script was finally being rewritten by the victims. Jake was dragged out of the building in a straitjacket, his eyes darting around as he tried to find a camera to play to. Even in defeat, he was performing. The police found Jenna in a hidden room beneath a local warehouse. Not the family cabin. The cabin had been a red herring to send the police the wrong way. Jenna was dehydrated and traumatized, but alive. The two friends reunited at the hospital, holding on to each other as the sun began to rise over the city. During the trial, it was revealed that Jake was actually an identity thief named Elias, who had targeted dozens of women across the country. He would study their lives for months before making his move, creating a bespoke nightmare for each one. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah and Jenna sat in the front row as the judge handed down the verdict, feeling a small sense of justice, but knowing the fear would never fully vanish. Sarah moved to a small town where people still knew their neighbors by name. She got rid of her smartphone and deleted all her social media accounts, choosing to live a low-tech life. She worked as a librarian, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the quiet safety of books. She still checked the locks on the library doors every hour, but she was slowly learning to breathe again without the feeling of a script being written for her by a stranger. Jenna stayed in the city but became a private investigator, specializing in tracking digital stalkers and cyber predators. She used her trauma as a fuel to help other women before their stories turned into tragedies. She and Sarah spoke every day on a landline, their bond forged in the fire of that nightmare. They were no longer the best friends from the photos on Jake's wall. They were survivors who had taken back their own narratives from a monster. One day, A man walked into Sarah's library and asked for a book on modern theater. Sarah felt a jolt of panic as she looked at his navy blue shirt, but then she saw his kind eyes and the way he smiled at his young daughter. She realized that not every stranger was a predator, but she also knew she would never be off guard again. She pointed him toward the correct aisle and went back to her work, her hand resting on the hidden alarm button under the desk. She received a letter from the prison where Elias was being held. It was an invitation to a reconciliation meeting, a chance to face him one last time. Sarah tore the letter into tiny pieces and threw them into the fireplace. She didn't need a meeting. She had already won by living a life that he couldn't control. She watched the paper burn, the flames turning the white sheets into ash, just like the script he had tried to force her to follow. Sarah and Jenna met for a weekend in the mountains, choosing a place with no Wi-Fi and no cameras. They hiked through the woods, enjoying the silence of nature and the simple joy of being alive. They talked about their futures, about travel and work, and for the first time in years they didn't mention the man in the navy polo. He was a shadow that had been erased by the light of their friendship and the strength of their shared survival. As they sat by the campfire, Jenna looked at Sarah and said, "We're the authors now." Sarah nodded, looking up at the vast, star-filled sky. She realized that the world was full of beauty and danger, but she was no longer afraid of the dark. She had faced the doppelganger and come out as a whole person, stronger and more resilient than the girl who had once opened her door to a stranger with a perfect lying smile. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to the crackling of the fire. The rhythmic sound was peaceful, a far cry from the terrifying footsteps in her hallway. She fell asleep under the stars, knowing that her life was hers alone. The script was finished, the actors were gone, and the theater was empty. She was finally free to live her own story, one day at a time, without looking back at the mirror to see who was standing behind her.